Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
Islamists clash with anti-military protesters in Egypt. Kuwait marred by violence on eve of election. And Pakistan rejects NATO report on links to the Afghan Taliban. Mosaic World News from the Middle East begins now.
In Egypt, over 70 people were wounded, most with minor injuries, in confrontations and skirmishes that took place yesterday between supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood and protesters from other political movements at the headquarters of the People's Assembly of Egypt.
This comes as elections for specialized committees in the Assembly resulted in the Freedom and Justice Party and the Salafist Al-Noor Party winning a majority of the Council's committees. Meanwhile, other parties withdrew from the elections to protest what they referred to as the Islamists' monopoly in heading the committees.
With an overwhelming majority, the Islamists dominated the specialized committees in the People's Assembly. The Muslim Brotherhood and its allied blocs won 15 seats, while the Salafists won the 4 remaining chairs in the Assembly committees, with some representatives rejecting the Military Council's issuance of a new presidential election law.
We demand the Military Council retract this law. If it wants to pass this law, it should submit it through the government so the People's Assembly can review it and then amend it, change it, or reject it.
Prime Minister Kamal al-Ganzouri's presence added tension to the session, during which he demanded government support for the Military Council's tasks in providing security and calming protests. He also announced the majority of the revolution's victims had been compensated. He confirmed real compensation is not financial.
Compensation for the revolution's martyrs, Egypt's martyrs, and the injured cannot be measured in any shape or form with material or financial compensation or employment and housing. It can only be compensated with retribution.
Al-Ganzouri presented his government's efforts to improve the economy in the country, which he said is closely related to improving the security situation. This time, al-Ganzouri faced the political game's new rules in the People's Assembly. The majority is ready to support the government in any critical position, but the Assembly maintains its readiness to observe and criticise the government's performance. Egypt's heads of state are not accustomed to this new environment, and that was the case for many long decades. Outside the session, protesters gathered to demand an immediate end to the Military Council's rule and the transfer of power to the People's Assembly. This, as the brothers insist on committing to the deadline set for the transfer of power to an elected president. This led the protesters to clash with several members of the Brotherhood, accusing them of allying themselves with the military, a claim the Brotherhood rejects. The clashes led to injuries on both sides. Ahmed Al-Kalani, Al Jazeera, Cairo.
Egypt, the cabinet is to hold crisis talks over the football-related violence that has left at least 74 people dead and more than 1,000 injured. The violence erupted after a game between the teams Al-Ahli and Al-Masri in Port Said. Security officials say fans of the winning Al-Masri flooded the field, attacking the players and fans of their opponents Al-Ahli. There are also reports that rocks, bottles, and fireworks were thrown onto the field in the biggest disaster in the history of Egyptian football. The state prosecutor has ordered an immediate investigation into the violence. Meanwhile, Parliament says it will convene an emergency session. The army has deployed troops in Port Said to contain any further outbreak of the violence. Well, our correspondent in Egypt, Karim Gamal-Uddin, has more on the football violence in Port Said. Let's listen in.
We're hearing the death tolls are increasing every minute, and we're following the reports of the Ministry of Health, and thousands have been injured due to these clashes. And it is believed that these clashes was caused one of the reasons of these clashes is that one of the ultra fans of Al-Ahli, which is a major football club in Egypt, held a banner that used some profanity against the other team of al-Masri from Port Said, and also the National Council for Sport, as a consequence of this, has halted the Egyptian League until they further investigate into the issue.
In Bahrain, jailed anti-regime protesters are still on a hunger strike after 3 days. The top Interior Ministry officials said some 100 jailed activists are on strike, but the Bahrain Center for Human Rights has put the number at 250. The prisoners began a one-week hunger strike on Sunday in protest at the ongoing suppression of anti-regime protesters. Bahrain is in the midst of a revolution that started in mid-February of last year. Regime forces have killed scores of people and arrested hundreds more during crackdown on peaceful protests. A report by an independent inquiry last year said the regime has systematically tortured and detained protesters and has used extensive force against demonstrators. New footage from Bahrain shows Saudi-backed forces firing toxic tear gas into a civilian car. Now, the video shows witnesses rushing to help a woman suffering from tear gas inhalation in the car, dragging her to safety. Regime forces constantly use poisonous tear gas to curb anti-regime protests. Many people, including women and children, have experienced choking on tear gas since the uprising began last year. The use of poisonous tear gas is not limited to the streets. Regime forces have also fired the gas on detainees on a hunger strike. February the 1st marks the anniversary of the return home of the late Imam Khomeini from exile in 1979. The day starts a period of celebrations across Iran known as the 10-Day Dawn. Saman Kujuri has more.
Celebrations marking the 33rd anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. Iranians nationwide are commemorating the event. Streets are decorated and special ceremonies are held in commemoration of the arrival of a great man who changed the course of history, Imam Khomeini. In Tehran, thousands of people from different walks of life, among them students and military forces, attended the mausoleum of late founder of the Islamic Revolution, Imam Khomeini, south of Tehran, to commemorate the anniversary of his return to Iran on February 1st, 1979.
Imam Khomeini devoted most of his social and political life to the welfare of the Iranian nation. I am sure that his legacy will live on for years to come, and as a young Iranian, I will follow his path.
Kuwaiti voters will head to the ballot boxes tomorrow to participate in legislative elections that the opposition is expected to win. Candidates are calling for drastic reforms, a new constitution, and a constitutional monarchy. On the eve of the elections, police clashed with tribesmen who stormed a TV station over an interview with a pro-government candidate.
يخوض 286 مرشحا المنافسة للفوز
285 candidates are competing for the 50-seat assembly in an unprecedented election. Observers describe the current electoral scene as a process for change that could determine the future of Kuwait. On one hand, this change depends on the fresh blood entering the assembly, and on the other, it relates to the extent of cooperation between the new parliament and government, expected to continue to be headed by Sheikh Jamr Mubarak al-Hamad al-Sabah, Sheikh Nasser's successor.
مبارك الحمد الصباح خلف الشيخ ناصر. الاحتقان وحدة الخطابات السياسية ولغة الاتهامات.
The anger, sharp political speeches, counter-accusations, and electoral financing have created an increasingly tense electoral scene. 10 members of parliament will be elected from 5 districts by 400,000 voters. 2 essential factors dominate the alliances and vote: sectarianism and tribalism.
والتصويت وهما الطائفية والقبلية.
As tribal sentiment rises in Kuwait, police clashed with young tribesmen who stormed the local TV station Al-Watan that was hosting a pro-government candidate. The candidate accused some tribesmen of not being real Kuwaitis. This comes one day after another candidate's headquarters was set ablaze over accusations that he insulted the Muter tribe. A number of the attackers and police officers were injured in the confrontations that erupted after hundreds of tribesmen gathered in front of the Al-Watan TV station.
أمام مقر قناة الوطن.
للأسف الشديد هي نتيجة Unfortunately, it is the result of the behavior of some candidates who underestimate this community, and the tribes reacted. The youth were also incited by certain candidates.
The
demands accompanying the electoral campaigns are for drastic reforms, including a new constitution and a multi-party system. There are calls for the parliamentary majority to select the head of the government and establish a constitutional monarchy. This country's residents are accustomed to participating in great numbers in elections, as parliament is key to enacting reforms in a region that has long lacked a reformist political movement that recognizes the democratic process.
In Pakistan, the military announced the deaths of more than 20 members of Pakistan's Taliban in airstrikes launched by the army on Taliban hideouts in the country's northwestern tribal region of Orakzai.
Meanwhile, the Pakistani foreign minister headed to Kabul on a diplomatic mission aimed at improving the strained bilateral relations of the two neighbouring countries.
Pakistani Foreign Minister Hina Rabbani Ghar's visit to Kabul coincided with the release of a secret NATO report accusing the Pakistani intelligence agency of supporting the Afghan-based Taliban, which said it has no intention of holding talks with Afghan authorities. Al-Sagar Salam has the details.
There's a heavy burden straining the bilateral relations of Islamabad and Kabul, and both sides are equally affected by such a deterioration. Meanwhile, the Pakistani foreign minister arrived in Kabul in a bid to ease tension between the two neighboring countries. The Pakistani minister's visit comes at a sensitive time amid an exchange of accusations on the two sides.
I don't think these claims are new.
I don't think these claims are new. These claims have been made for many years, and all of us know the hidden reasons behind them. We have joint agendas with most of the world's main players. But most importantly, we must examine the current talks between the Taliban and several of the world's major capitals.
The Taliban seems to be the knife that is severing ties between the two neighboring countries. Afghan President Hamid Karzai and Asif Ali Zardari held talks late last year in an attempt to open a new chapter of their country's relationship. At that time, the issue of holding talks with the Taliban was the focus of discussion in a bid to reach a peace deal marking an end to a decade of conflict between the two countries. Kabul has openly and often accused Pakistan of supporting the Afghan Taliban movement, which possesses bases in tribal areas along the Pakistani side of the border. Kabul's suspicion is echoed by a new secret military report for NATO forces, accusing the Pakistani government of supporting the Afghanistan-based Taliban. The report added that the Pakistani government and intelligence service know the locations of senior Taliban leaders. To add insult to injury, the Taliban said it has no intention of holding talks with the Afghan government under the auspices of the Saudi kingdom. Will NATO's report and Taliban's denial be the mercy bullet that derails the rapprochement efforts of the two countries? Or will it be a summer cloud that merely passes by?
Local coordination committees said 56 people were killed by the gunfire of military and security forces in Syria today. Most of them were in the city of Homs and the Wadi Barada region northwest of Damascus. The Free Syrian Army controls some towns in the Wadi Barada region. This comes as the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said 15 regime soldiers were killed in the countryside of Homs in confrontations with defectors, while civilians in a number of the city's neighborhoods were killed by the gunfire of the security forces.
This is another bloody day in Syria, as shown in these images and reports emerging from a number of cities and towns across the country. Military and security forces continue to attack defectors and armed men who have taken control of numerous parts of the country. Various sources confirm that government forces managed to control the towns located in eastern Syria. However, violent battles broke out in the west, more specifically in a region known as Wadi Barada, where the Syrian Free Army controls Zabadani and several towns nearby. Opposition sources confirm that 6 defected soldiers were killed in clashes near Ain al-Fija. As usual, Homs and its countryside are witnessing the most violent conflicts. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights confirmed that 15 regime forces were killed in clashes with groups of defectors in the Bustan Diwan neighborhood. The observatory also confirmed that 8 civilians were killed by the security forces' gunfire in a number of neighborhoods of the city. The Syrian Foreign Ministry said it inflicted significant damages to what it referred to as armed terrorist groups, alluding to what appeared to be a massive attack that was deterred by the military and security forces several days ago. Even though the regime's forces succeeding in regaining control over certain regions, other areas were taken over by defectors who are out of the regime's control. For instance, defectors control most neighborhoods of Rastan.
تقول وسائل الإعلام الرسمية إن مجموعة إرهابية هاجمت سيارة.
Syrian state TV said a terrorist group attacked a car transporting supplies to a military unit in the countryside of Daraa. The Syrian news agency said special institutions and the car's escort team confronted the attack, and 11 terrorists were killed during the clashes. These developments, which led to a rise in the death toll, did not stop protests demanding the downfall of the Syrian president's regime, as shown in these images from the suburb of Qatar near Damascus. The official news agency asserts that groups of terrorists and gunmen are behind these protests, and the people are demanding they be eliminated, according to a statement by the foreign minister Walid al-Muallim several days ago. This statement may explain the massive destruction in the area caused by confrontations between the army backed by the security forces and opposition forces. Firas Kalani, BBC.
Deputy Secretary General of the Arab League, Ahmed Ben Heli, said the League is committed to resolving the Syrian crisis within the Arab framework. Ben Heli's statements came during his visit to the Iraqi capital, Baghdad.
We are committed to resolving this crisis with the opposition and the Syrian government within the Arab framework without any foreign intervention, in a framework that guarantees Syria's stability, security, unity, and independence, and reflects and responds to the Syrian people's aspirations for development, modernization, and reform.
On the other hand, U.S. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon reiterated the necessity of taking proper steps to stop the violence and human loss in Syria, considering it key for a political solution.
We cannot wait any longer until the political process is finished, while many people are being killed. While I fully support the political solution of this issue, this is quite advisable. But first and foremost, we have to take necessary action so that we will not lose any more human lives. Therefore, first, the violence. All violence must stop, and I sincerely hope that it will lead to a political solution.
Arriving in Israel this morning, United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called on Israel to make some confidence-building gestures toward the Palestinians in order to encourage direct talks between the two sides to get the peace process moving forward again. Ban also spoke about the violent situation in Syria and his fears over the Iranian nuclear weapons program. Joining me now in the studio, IBA's Ellie Walgelander. Good evening, Ellie.
Good evening, Yochanan. Yes, it was a very busy day for Ban Ki-moon as the UN Secretary General shuttled from place to place to meet with Israeli leaders, and there was a lot on the agenda in all of his talks. We'll start first with his visit this afternoon with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The main topics, of course, were Iran and the peace talks with the Palestinians. Ban told Netanyahu that settlement building is not helpful, and he urged Israel to further refrain from further construction.
I remain hopeful that direct, frequent exchanges between the parties will continue. I also hope that Israel will be forthcoming with its own concrete proposals on territory and security as called for by the Quartet, in order to reach agreement on all final status issues before the end of this year. The success of Amman talks is in the interest of both Israelis and the Palestinians. I commend the Prime Minister Netanyahu, his commitment to a two-state solution. This is the moment to display further leadership to ensure that negotiations continue.
Netanyahu said that the issue of settlements is not the reason for the lack of negotiations.
The question of the settlements is not the core of the conflict, but one of its results. For 50 years, from 1920 to 1967, almost half a century, 47 years, the Palestinians and others in the Arab world waged an unrelenting assault on Israel to eliminate the state of Israel. There wasn't a single Israeli settlement. There wasn't a single Israeli soldier in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. But they attacked us for half a century. Why? Well, they were very clear about it, to eradicate the state of Israel. As a result of this noose of death that was placed on us in the weeks before June 6, 1967, we broke through. And we came to be in control of these areas that happened to form the heart of our ancestral homeland. We recognize there has to be an arrangement, an agreement, probably a painful agreement from our point of view, given our attachment to these historic lands. But to say that this conflict is driven by something, by the result of an Arab aggression, is to substitute the result of this aggression for its cause. The real cause, the core of the conflict, is the persistent refusal to recognize the state of Israel as the state of the Jewish people in any border, in any configuration.
I'll be back later in the program with more on today's visit by Ban Ki-moon. Yochanan?
All right, Ellie, thanks for that report. To the surprise of no one, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu emerged victorious in yesterday's Likud party leadership contest. Netanyahu won by a comfortable 3-to-1 margin, gaining 75% of the vote over his right-wing rival, Moshe Feiglin. The result followed a tense day of voting and a relatively disappointing turnout. Only about 50% of the 125,000 registered party members actually showed up to cast their ballots, although this was more than the last time the primary was held. Declaring a victory at a celebration in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu said that the real Likud had won. Netanyahu also told the gathering that the general elections are still a ways off and there were challenges to overcome in the meantime. This was the 5th time that Netanyahu has won a Likud leadership contest.
The Palestinian Prisoners Club said the occupation's prison administration informed the club's lawyer that prisoner Hadar Adnan announced he will no longer drink fluids in the protest of the administration denying him the right to meet with his lawyer. Earlier, the Ofer court postponed the hearing about Hadar Adnan's administrative detention to today, Wednesday. In this context, the High Follow-Up Committee for Prisoner Affairs organized a sit-in in solidarity with prisoner Hadar Adnan, who has been on an open-ended hunger strike for 45 days.
In protest of the repressive practices and rights violations by the occupation's prison administration that prisoner Hadar Adnan has endured, the High Follow-Up Committee for Prisoner Affairs organized a sit-in in front of the Red Cross headquarters in Al-Bira as Adnan began the 45th day of his open-ended hunger strike. A number of official figures and families of prisoners took part in the sit-in.
Right now, Hadar Adnan is standing like a beam of shining light with his 45-day hunger strike against his tyrannical Israeli policy that violates laws and human rights. Therefore, we must unite all our people in order to gain more momentum to fight for those who sacrificed their freedom for us.
This sit-in is in solidarity with the prisoner who has been on a hunger strike for 45 days, Sheikh Hadar Adnan. Here in front of the International Red Cross, we send our greetings to the hunger-striking prisoner, and we hold the Israeli government responsible for his life and the deterioration of his health due to the hunger strike.
Hadar's father sent a message to the whole world that everyone must immediately intervene in order to save the life of his dear son, especially since his health has been continuously deteriorating.
I swear to God the Almighty, my son Hadar does not enjoy this hunger or thirst. He has a wife and children. He has a father and a mother. They need him back. They need their family member back.
We are by your side, by the side of all administrative detainees and all prisoners in solitary confinement. We came here today to protest in solidarity with our prisoners, the detained representatives in the occupation's prisons, the prisoners who are ill and old, and all the men and women behind these prison bars.
Prisoner Khadar Adnan was arrested on December 17, 2011 without charge, which forced him to go on a hunger strike for 45 days in protest of the abuses he has endured in the executioner's basements and of his continued administrative detainment. Sarah Al-Albira, Palestine TV.
In Tulkarm, families of prisoners condemned the repressive practices and measures taken by the prison authorities against their imprisoned family members. They threatened to escalate the protests against these practices.
The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible by grants from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Wincote Foundation, the Firedoll Foundation, and by support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news, read our blog, get transcripts of past shows, and more at linktv.org/mosaic. Airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories, world news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.